Monsieur le Président, la loi
Mr. Speaker, the Act to amend the Citizenship Act introduced by the Liberal-NDP government threatens the integrity and security of Canadian citizenship. In December 2023, the Ontario Superior Court declared that the first-generation exclusion rule is unconstitutional. The Superior Court stated that there is a 50% error rate in the Liberal-run Citizenship Service with abnormal delays. The Liberal-NDP government's response is Bill C-71, which confers citizenship on children born outside Canada to a parent who is a Canadian citizen and has spent at least 1,095 non-consecutive days in Canada. It should also be noted that the bill does not require a robust criminal record check. The bill is irresponsible, as it will introduce tens of thousands of new Canadian citizens without any integration plan. If this bill becomes law, the government will have no idea how many people will automatically be granted Canadian citizenship. Registering, verifying eligibility, and resolving legal disputes require considerable resources, which could be better allocated to other areas. These resources could be allocated to housing, our healthcare system, our defense, but unfortunately, these are not priorities for the Liberal-NDP government. Their priority is to create thousands of new citizens without any verification of who they are and what their contribution to Canadian society would be. Beyond the economic factors, the bill risks compromising Canada's national identity. Citizenship is more than just legal status. It reflects a sense of belonging to national values, culture, and responsibilities. Suddenly, increasing the number of citizens with no real connection to Canada could dilute Canadian identity and harm social cohesion in Canada. When the Conservatives are back in government, we will stabilize and repair our broken immigration system that the Liberals and NDP neglected. We will enforce a stricter, more responsible requirement for Canadian citizenship. We will reduce and even eliminate the error rate in the Citizenship Service, and we will end unfair delays in our immigration system. After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the chaos or the incompetence. Only common-sense Conservatives will put an end to this government's careless mismanagement and fix our dysfunctional immigration and citizenship system.
Mr. Speaker, we are debating Bill C-71, a bill that makes a number of significant changes with respect to citizenship in Canada. And I want to say a few words about citizenship before I delve into the specific components of this legislation. I think it's important to understand and to reaffirm that citizenship is a profound compact between a group of people, people who take on membership in shared community, who commit to working to advance a shared common good. who commit themselves to being invested in the common good of a people in a particular place, and to understand the common good in terms of generally particular virtues, particular practices, and reverence for a particular history. It is not the process merely of claiming certain rights or entitlements. Of course, there are rights that flow from citizenship. But citizenship is not merely a collection of rights. Citizenship is a moral commitment that we make to each other as part of a common community. And I am very glad that in Canada, citizenship is not defined by ethnicity, by religion, by race, by a single language. That Canadian citizenship is understood in terms that are accessible to anyone regardless of their background. But that does not mean that anybody who wants to become a Canadian citizen necessarily can, nor that anyone who asserts that they are or should be a Canadian citizen is a Canadian citizen. Our citizenship is not constrained or defined by a particular ethnic identity. Our citizenship is defined by certain shared civic values, by a place, by the commitments we make to each other in that place. Citizenship ceremonies, the times at which people that are not Canadian citizens become Canadian citizens, are therefore profound and monumental moments, comparable in many respects to a wedding. But we've seen under this government, I think, a declining appreciation for the power and moral the power and moral significance of citizenship, expressed in the declining reverence for citizenship ceremonies. You know, imagine, Mr. Speaker, if you or someone in your life was getting married, and they needed to get a justice of the peace to perform that ceremony for them, and they called and they were told, well, your only option is a virtual marriage. You know, that's all that's available now. We're not doing in-person weddings anymore. You've got to go on a Zoom call and take your vows that way, and that's all that's available to you. That would be obviously outrageous, and yet the message for a long time that many people seeking to go through that process of becoming new citizens, they were in some cases the only option they were given was a virtual ceremony. Still, I think in many cases people are pushed or encouraged towards that option, and I think that's unacceptable. We should recognize and appreciate the profound significance of citizenship and citizenship ceremonies. Now, the other problem, and I encountered this summer, and I think it's important bringing this to the attention of the House, is instances where public servants representing the executive branch of the government are demanding the right to vet and approve the remarks of members of Parliament being given at citizenship ceremonies. I experienced this. I was invited to participate in a citizenship ceremony that served people in my own constituency. I was excited to be there. A very good personal friend of mine was receiving her citizenship at that time, as well as many other new Canadians. But I was told that I had to send my remarks to public servants in advance, who would then review and approve those remarks or not. And the Parliament Secretary is shaking her head. I welcome her comments on this, because I think it's a serious matter that should concern all members in all parties. As happens from time to time in this country when there are changes in government, I suspect that Liberal members in opposition would have the same feelings that I do if public servants told them that they had to have their remarks reviewed and vetted in advance. So these are the kinds of things we see from this government around citizenship ceremonies: a push to virtual and a push to more executive control of what is said, and I think that's unacceptable. citizenship ceremonies are profound and important moments because they are the moments at which people are entering into the Canadian family. I sent in ChatGPT generated remarks for review by officials at the citizenship ceremony this summer. I did not deliver those remarks. I delivered different remarks in which I emphasized the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom indeed as an essential part of the core of Canadian identity. And I was very pleased by some of the feedback I received from new citizens who were welcomed into the Canadian family on that day. Now, let's talk, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about citizenship. Let's talk about rights. So what a right is something that is due in virtue of justice. Justice obliges that certain things be given to certain people in particular situations. A right is what is due. Generally speaking, we're talking about due to a person in virtue of justice. When we talk about human rights, we're talking about rights that are due to all people in virtue of their humanity. And there's a certain category of rights there. Then there are other rights that are not due to all humans, but that are due in particular contexts. For instance, a worker has a right to wages in virtue of justice because they have done work and are therefore entitled to receive their wages. There are certain rights that flow from citizenship. That is, rights that are due in virtue of justice to an individual who has made the commitments associated with being a citizen. There are certain rights, like the rights to vote. The right to vote in a Canadian election is not something due to all human beings because they're human beings. Rather, they are rights that are due to all citizens because they are citizens. That is, a right flows from justice, we're talking about, but justice provides for certain entitlements in certain contexts that may not exist in other contexts. Okay, so citizenship entails certain rights that come from that moral commitment that is citizenship. Okay, so this is the sort of philosophical framework that I bring to discussion of this bill. So let's talk about what the provisions of the bill are. There are a number of provisions that we agree with, and I may have a chance to touch on the ones we agree with. I won't spend a lot of time on those because I think it makes more sense to spend time talking about the areas that are contentious. So the point of contention in this bill, and the reasons why we are concerned about the bill, is that this bill would change the rules for how citizenship is passed on through multiple generations to people who are living outside of the country. Right now, the rule is that if I am traveling abroad if my wife and I, let's say, are traveling abroad at a time when we have another child, let's say in 2.5 years we have a seventh, hypothetically, right? Not implausible. If we have another child and we're abroad at that time, that child is a Canadian citizen.
When you have another child.
However, if that child is then abroad when they have another child, that next generation, so not in this hypothetical my child, but my grandchild, would not be a citizen. And the principle behind that present legal reality is that if a family has relocated outside of Canada, and they are living outside of Canada, generation after generation after generation, if they are living there, engaging with that particular community, then over time there is, I think, necessarily a kind of diminishment of connection to Canada. We're not talking about someone who has gone to work for a couple of years and then come back, because we're talking about an instance where generation after generation after generation. Again, it's not the children of a Canadian born abroad. It's when the child of a Canadian born abroad then has a child also born abroad. That is the present law. But the Liberals are proposing with Bill C-71 to change that law, to allow without limit Canadian citizenship to be passed to generation after generation after generation. So it means that if one of my children were to move out of the country and then they were to marry someone there, have children, their children had children, for an unlimited number of generations, they could still, provided that they visited Canada at certain points in their life, they could retain that citizenship. It seems unreasonable to me, Mr. Speaker, to us in the Conservative Party, that people should be retaining Canadian citizenship for dozens of generations living away from this place. It doesn't seem obvious to me that someone who is not living here, whose family has not lived here for generations, should have access to the rights that flow from citizenship, because their lives involve engagement with and moral commitments to communities that are elsewhere. And obviously there's nothing wrong with a person making that choice and choosing for whatever reasons to want to live somewhere. But at some point you recognize the reality that you don't, that you are not connected to this place in the same way that someone who lives here is. Someone who is living here, working here, paying taxes here, volunteering in a community here. Now, many Canadian citizens choose to live abroad for periods of time, of course. But it's reasonable to establish some kind of parameters around how long a series of generations would be abroad before you might say, okay, it seems like there's been an opting out of being Canadian and an opting into being somewhere else. So Conservatives are opposed to this proposal from the government for a dramatic expansion of citizenship such that citizenship could be passed on by those living outside of Canada for an infinite number of generations. The member for Winnipeg North talked about, in defense of this bill, that these are people who believe that they are Canadians. And of course we understand that the way the law works is that you're not a Canadian just because you believe you are a Canadian. There are certain criteria that we establish in a democratic way. So what we're proposing on this side of the House is that it's reasonable to establish those parameters in the way they presently are defined, not to further expand them in this unpredictable way. The government can't answer how many people are affected by this. I do want to briefly just touch on the absurd nonsense for the member from the member for Timmins James Bay. Rarely worth dignifying with a response here, but I think it's important to point out that citizenship is important. It's not something that everybody is entitled to. We should agree that it is legitimate for a people to democratically set parameters around what it means to be a citizen. The member for Timmins James Bay would have you believe that even trying to have that conversation and talking about what those parameters are is necessarily bigoted. And I would say that that kind of rhetoric is very dangerous because it delegitimizes legitimate and serious conversations about immigration. I think we can have legitimate, serious, substantive conversations about immigration and citizenship that recognize resource challenges, that recognize the need for reasonable parameters, that also recognize universal human dignity. And I think we need to have those conversations. Because if legitimate conversations about immigration are shut down by this constant and I think malicious charge and insubstantiated charge of bigotry, then we're not actually going to be able to talk about what reasonable, just, and fair rules are. And that kind of extremism from the NDP really undermines our ability to have substantive, thoughtful conversations that advance the common good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.